Fire has been a major part of Australia's landscape for thousands of years. Her hot and dry climate means that devastating fires can be triggered by the slightest provocation, blackening the landscape and displacing wildlife. But fires have been harnessed by Australians for thousands of years, first as an enhanced hunting method for Aboriginal people. More recently, fires have been used deliberately for prescribed burning. These programs aim to reduce fuel loads, thereby reducing the severity of potential wildfires. Numerous Australians choose to reside in fire-prone areas. Prescribed burning has been successful in reducing the severity of some bushfires, minimising their cost to human life and property. In addition to fuel reduction efforts, prescribed fires continue to be used in Australia for ecological reasons. The rationale behind this is that Australian habitats have adapted accordingly to her propensity for bushfires, and therefore some fire is beneficial to the environment. But what does prescribed fires mean for Australian rare native animals such as the western ringtail possum? There are some, such as the Australian Wildlife Protection Council, who uploaded this image, that would argue that these controlled burns are actually turning some of these rare animals into well-done animals. And where the fires are not fatal, the displaced wildlife are exposed to predation to a far greater extent than they would have been. An article was published in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 27th of May 2014, written by Peter Hannam, who covers broad environmental issues ranging from climate change to renewable energy for Fairfax Media, which discusses the catastrophic decline in the native mammal populations in Australia. The article is structured around an interview with Professor Chris Johnson, currently based at the University of Tasmania. Professor Johnson also highlights that about 100 marsupial species are at risk of extinction, and there has been a 90% drop in mammal numbers in the world-famous Kakadu National Park over 20 years. This demonstrates that the unsustainable effect of native wildlife that can then be transferred to economic losses as the national park declines in value. Finally, Professor Johnson is quoted as saying that often burns are poorly targeted to achieve area quotas, rather than outcomes casting a dubious light on their value for protecting people, place and profit. The article largely reinforces the position of the Australian Wildlife Council, so we will now examine the information present in peer-reviewed journal articles for comparison. Beggs, Martin and Price published this graph in the Australian Wildlife Research Journal, which examines the estimated total population of 4 species of marsupials in Little Noarlunga Rock National Park in the Northern Territory. The unbroken lines represent males and the broken lines females. We can see from the result that only Antechinus billerani males in the first graph experienced a decrease in colonies with the first fire event, represented here by the horizontal line. So in this instance, the effect of fire on native mammals seems small, thus having little implications on sustainability. Looking at different sources, the cleverly named article Burning for Biodiversity or Burning Biodiversity, which would have been our first choice of title for this presentation if it was not for the existence of lawyers, presents an interesting story when biodiversity is examined by the author rather than total numbers. On this slide, we can see the effects of fire on plant biodiversity when alpha diversity or assemblage is measured before, immediately after, and 9 months after either prescribed fire or wildfire. The broken lines stand for burnt area in each case, where the unbroken line represents a control of unburnt areas from the same site. It can be plainly seen that in both cases, the burnt area manifested greater biodiversity than the unburnt areas, although the prescribed burn produced greater diversity than the wildfire, as the scale of the two graphs are slightly different. This represents the ideal scenario for an ecological burn, but does it apply for native mammals? Unfortunately, the answer is no. When Patro, Dickman, and Lecton perform the same analysis on mammal diversity, we can see that regardless of what type of fire occurred, the mammal biodiversity was always lower in the burnt areas than unburnt areas. This suggests that no fire is better than a controlled one. This apparently contradicts what was present in the previous article. However, it is possible that 4 species studied in the article were for whatever reason less susceptible to fire. It is important to note the steep decline following the wildfire compared to the prescribed fire. What this means is that if a prescribed fire prevented a wildfire by reducing fuel loads, the intervention would have had a positive impact on biodiversity. Regrettably, there appears to be some mismanagement in the choice of burning sites, as described by Professor Johnson in the newspaper article. In conclusion, fire has the power to greatly affect communities of native mammals. However, the sustainability of its effects depend on the responsible and scientific use by natural resource managers. Irresponsible use may deprive us of biodiversity whose intrinsic value attracts revenues to places like Kakadu National Park, whereas responsible use may prevent greater loss in the future.